Sandra Beltrán was no stranger to power. She was born into it, cradled in fine silks, to the distant sound of negotiations that sealed fates and ended lives. Niece of the legendary Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the godfather of the Guadalajara cartel, she grew up in a universe where loyalty was a currency as volatile as the Mexican peso, and violence was a universal language. From an early age, she learned to observe, to calculate, and to mask her formidable intelligence behind a stunning smile and the posture of a queen. In a world brutally carved by men, Sandra was seen as a jewel, an exotic ornament in the court of crime, but inside a flame of ambition burned, waiting for the right moment to set fire to the empire that underestimated her. If you connect with stories of complex characters who defied destiny, please consider subscribing to the channel. We are close to reaching our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and knowing where you're watching from motivates us to continue. Leave a comment. Your participation is fundamental to us. Life in Guadalajara was a dangerous dance between ostentatious luxury and constant paranoia. The parties at the mansions in Zapopan were legendary events where corrupt politicians toasted with hitmen, and the scent of expensive tequila mixed with the smell of freshly discharged gunpowder. Sandra moved through these halls with feline grace, her haute couture dress gliding across marble floors, her eyes capturing every detail, every exchanged glance, every whisper that could mean a new alliance or an imminent death sentence. She was the perfect hostess, the silent confidant, the woman everyone desired, but no one truly knew. Beneath the glamorous surface, she managed the finances, laundering millions of dollars as easily as she chose her jewelry, turning blood into gold, ensuring the gears of her uncle's machine kept turning smoothly, always from the shadows. Sandra's duality was her greatest weapon. In public, she was the personification of elegance and charm, a socialite whose beauty disarmed even the most hardened adversaries. However, in closed-door meetings, her eyes acquired a cold glint. Her once soft voice became as firm as steel, and her strategic mind dissected complex problems with surgical precision. She didn't need to shout or wield a weapon to command respect. Her power emanated from her unshakable confidence and her ability to predict her enemies' moves. She saw drug trafficking not as a business of brutality, but as a global-scale chess game where the pieces were human lives and the board was the routes that crossed the Pacific. This coldness was not innate, but forged in the fire of betrayal she had witnessed since childhood, an emotional armor to survive in the nest of vipers she called home. Despite her privileged position and the wealth that surrounded her, a feeling of dissatisfaction gnawed at Sandra from within. She was tired of being the brilliant mind behind the throne, the silent architect of operations that yielded fortunes and power for the men in her family. She watched her cousins, less intelligent and more impulsive, be hailed as leaders while she was relegated to the role of an advisor, her genius overshadowed by her gender. The desire for recognition was a hunger that money could not satisfy. She longed for the day her name would be whispered with the same fear and respect as her uncle's. This ambition was not just about power. It was about proving her worth, about breaking the invisible chains of machismo that bound her, transforming the controlled chaos she managed behind the scenes into a storm that would carry her name. Amidst the web of alliances and betrayals, there was Juan Diego Espinosa, El Tigre, a Colombian drug trafficker with the eyes of a predator and a charisma that rivaled her own. Their relationship was a combustion of passion and power, a bond forged both in bed and at the negotiating table. With him, Sandra felt a spark of equality. El Tigre saw beyond her beauty, recognizing the sharp mind and relentless ambition that drove her. Together, they formed a formidable duo, uniting Colombian production with Mexican logistics. However, even in his arms, Sandra never completely let her guard down. In their world, love was a dangerous luxury, and trust was a weakness that could be exploited. The line between lover and rival was thin, and they both danced upon it, aware that any misstep could be fatal. Behind the facade of absolute control, Sandra fought an internal battle. Every decision she made, every order she gave, carried a moral weight that she buried under layers of pragmatism. The sound of a distant siren, the news of a body found on the city's outskirts, the pain in the eyes of a mother who lost a son to addiction or cartel violence. These were ghosts that haunted her in the rare hours of silence. She justified it to herself, saying she was just playing the game by the rules she'd been given, that her fight was for the survival and respect she deserved. But the question lingered in her mind. How far would she go? What was the price of her throne? The ambition that drove her was also the poison that corroded her soul, and she feared the day she would no longer recognize the woman in the mirror. Before her meteoric rise, Sandra spent years, meticulously and discreetly, building her network of influence. She cultivated contacts in every sphere of society, judges, police chiefs, high-ranking politicians. She did it, not with threats, but with favors, generous gifts, and privileged information, creating a web of loyalty based on debt and mutual interest. She understood that true power came not from the barrel of a gun, but from the ability to manipulate the structures that governed the country. While the men of her cartel flaunted their strength with armed convoys and explicit violence, Sandra operated in the shadows, turning the system into her protective shield. This groundwork, invisible to most, would be the foundation upon which she would erect her own empire, an empire of quiet, organized chaos. The stage was set. Sandra Beltrán, the underestimated niece, the brilliant mind behind the scenes, had become an indispensable piece in the cartel's machinery. She controlled the flow of money, possessed crucial information, and maintained the contacts that guaranteed the organization's impunity. She felt power pulsing through her veins, a contained force on the verge of exploding. The apparent harmony within the clan was merely the calm before the storm. A large shipment of cocaine, the biggest in the cartel's history, was en route to the Pacific coast, an operation she herself had planned in meticulous detail. The success of this venture would consolidate her position for good, but she knew a triumph of this magnitude would also pull her out of the shadows, placing her directly in the crosshairs of her enemies and the authorities. The Queen was about to claim her throne, and chaos was inevitable. The news arrived like a thunderclap from a cloudless sky, shattering the atmosphere of controlled confidence Sandra had built. The tuna boat, loaded with over 9 tons of pure cocaine, the crown jewel of her most ambitious operation, had been intercepted by the Mexican Navy in international waters. It wasn't an accident nor a stroke of luck for the authorities. It was a precise tip-off, information leaked from within, a betrayal of the highest order. The informant could only be someone with access to the most intimate details of the operation, someone from her circle of trust. Immediately, her eyes turned to the faces of her own family members, men who smiled at her during family dinners while sharpening the knives to stab her in the back. The financial loss was colossal, but what wounded her deeply was the breach of loyalty, the realization that, to them, she would always be a threat to be contained. The mansion's grand hall, once the stage for extravagant parties, transformed into an arena of accusations and distrust. Her cousins and uncles, their faces contorted by the fury of the million-dollar loss, were quick to point their fingers at her. It was her operation, her responsibility, her failure. Their words were venomous, questioning her competence, insinuating she had become too ambitious, that a woman shouldn't hold so much power. Sandra remained silent, absorbing every insult, every look of contempt. She watched them, not as a guilty party, but as a predator studying its prey. In that moment, disappointment gave way to a cold, crystalline anger. She realized they didn't see her as family, but as an asset that had depreciated. The underestimation that had always haunted her now manifested as a direct accusation, a pretext to put her back in her place. As the storm of recriminations raged around her, something inside Sandra broke and at the same time solidified. The pain of betrayal and public humiliation was the catalyst she needed. No, more operating in the shadows, being the anonymous architect of others' empires, no more waiting for a respect that would never be given willingly. In that instant, facing the men who judged her, she made an irrevocable decision. She would no longer wait for the cartel's justice or anyone's approval. She would hunt the traitor, reclaim what was rightfully hers, and build her own empire on the ashes of the one that scorned her. From that moment on, she would no longer be the advisor, but the commander. It was a silent vow, a promise to herself. If you've ever felt you had to take the reins of your life to be respected, you know the strength born from a moment like this. Subscribe if you believe we all have the power to rewrite our destiny. Her first move was not one of explosive violence, but of the surgical precision that characterized her. While her relatives were still shouting and planning brutish, brainless retaliations against rival cartels, Sandra retreated to her office. With a frightening calm, she began to pull the threads of her vast information network. She used her contacts in politics and the police, not to find the lost shipment, but to trace the flow of information that led to its seizure. She activated informants that no one in the cartel knew she had. Within hours, while the others drowned in alcohol and impotent rage, she already had a name, a low-ranking Navy officer who had received an exorbitant anonymous payment the week before. The trail was beginning to form, and the hunt would not be for the cartel's power, but for her personal revenge. The final confrontation with her family was brief and cutting. She presented her initial findings, not as a plea for help, but as a declaration of independence. When they mocked her leads and insisted on pursuing their own violent, indiscriminate methods, she simply turned her back on them. That same night, she sought out El Tigre, not as a lover seeking comfort, but as a sovereign proposing an alliance. She offered him a new, more audacious and profitable route, one that would completely bypass her family's corrupt structure. They spread chaos out of greed and stupidity, she told Juan Diego, her eyes glowing with a dangerous intensity. I will spread chaos with purpose. We are going to build something they cannot touch. The queen had abandoned the old kingdom. Now, she was ready to start her own war. The alliance with Juan Diego El Tigre Espinosa was sealed not with a handshake, but with a toast of aged tequila in a penthouse overlooking a sleeping Guadalajara. It wasn't a submission, but a merger of empires. He possessed the brute force, the direct contacts with producers in the Colombian jungles, and an army of loyal men. She held the strategic mind, the architect of invisible routes, and the key to unlocking the doors of Mexican institutional corruption. That night, they drew up plans for their first joint operation, an audacious sea route that would use low-profile submarines to bypass naval surveillance. There was an electricity between them, a mix of danger and ambition. For the first time, Sandra felt like a man's partner, not his possession, but the seed of mutual distrust remained, a shadow in the back of their eyes. Sandra's first target was not a rival, but the traitor who had humiliated her. Using the information she obtained, she tracked down the distant cousin who had sold the operation's details in exchange for a more prominent position. The sea revenge was poetic and ruthless. She didn't send a team of sicarios to riddle him with bullets in a vulgar display of force. Instead, she lured him to a meeting under the pretext of a truce in an abandoned warehouse in the industrial zone. There, before the few men loyal to her, she confronted him, not with anger, but with an icy disappointment. She methodically presented the evidence of his betrayal and then handed him a gun with a single bullet. Loyalty is all we have, she said softly. Without it, we are nothing. The shot that echoed in the warehouse's silence was the birth certificate of her new reputation. With the traitor eliminated, Sandra focused her energy on creating her new route. She named it El Velo, the veil, as it was designed to be invisible. The operation was a logistical masterpiece that combined cutting-edge technology and ancient cunning. Small fishing boats equipped with secret compartments transported the merchandise to motherships disguised as freighters in international waters, which in turn unloaded at corrupt ports controlled by her contacts. The key to success was decentralization and misinformation. Each cell of the operation knew only its part, making it impossible for a single capture to compromise the entire network. She personally supervised every detail, from weather patterns to the Coast Guard's shift change schedules. It was a complex and deadly ballet, and she was its sole choreographer, proving her mind was the cartel's most lethal weapon. Sandra knew that a one-woman army would conquer nothing. She needed loyalty, not blind obedience. She began to recruit her own personal guard, seeking out individuals who, like her, had been underestimated and discarded by traditional power structures. She found a genius pilot who had been expelled from the Air Force for insubordination, a brilliant accountant who was ignored in a law firm for being a woman, and a brutally effective security chief who had been betrayed by his former boss. She didn't just offer them money, she offered them respect, purpose, and a share of the profits. By valuing their skills and giving them autonomy, she forged a bond of loyalty that money couldn't buy, creating a dysfunctional but fiercely protective family in the heart of her growing empire. Soon, the narco corridos, ballads that narrate the exploits of traffickers, began to whisper a new name. They didn't speak of an El Padrino or a Jefe, but of La Reina del Pacifico, the Queen of the Pacific. The legend of Sandra Beltrán grew with each successful operation, with each rival who mysteriously disappeared. They told stories of her stunning beauty, which she used to disarm enemies before destroying them, and of her almost supernatural intelligence, which allowed her to always be 3 steps ahead of the authorities and her competitors. The chaos she spread in Jalisco was not one of anarchy, but of a new order. She dismantled old alliances, forced new negotiations, and rewrote the rules of the game. Her myth was a mixture of fear and admiration. The story of a woman who sat at a banquet of wolves and decided she would be the one to lead the pack. Sandra's unprecedented success and rising name did not go unnoticed across the border. In a sterile office in El Paso, DEA agent Mark Harrison, a stubborn and methodical man, began to connect the dots. He noticed a pattern in the seized shipments from other cartels and the sudden silence of informants in Jalisco. The operations were too clean, too intelligent. It wasn't the impulsive, brutal style he was used to. Harrison sensed the presence of a new mind in charge, a strategic intelligence that intrigued and worried him. He opened a new file, placing the nickname Queen of the Pacific at the top. The hunt had begun. To Harrison, Sandra wasn't just another trafficker. She was the checkmate he needed to validate his career, and he would dedicate every resource to toppling the Queen from her throne. To consolidate her power, Sandra hosted a party at her new hacienda that made her family's celebrations look like parish events. Famous musicians played by an illuminated pool, renowned chefs served exotic delicacies, and the tequila was from the country's most exclusive reserve. But it wasn't just a display of wealth. Every guest had been carefully selected: influential politicians, front businessmen, police chiefs, and even an army general. As she circulated among them, stunning in a red dress that contrasted with the coldness of her gaze, Sandra wasn't socializing. She was working. She gathered information, sealed silent deals, and strengthened her protection network. The party was a show of force, a clear message to everyone. She was not just a trafficker, she was the power in Jalisco, and it was safer to be on her side than in her way. With increased power, paranoia began to creep in like a poisonous fog. Sandra found herself analyzing every word, every gesture of those around her. The betrayal by her family had left a deep scar, and she struggled to fully trust anyone, even El Tigre. One night, after a mysterious call he received, she confronted him. The tension in the room was palpable, passion giving way to suspicion. Juan Diego, offended, argued that her distrust would destroy them faster than any DEA bullet. The confrontation ended in a stalemate, a fracture in their alliance that, though patched up, would never fully heal. Sandra realized the price of her throne: isolation. At the top, everyone who approaches either wants a piece of your power or is the blade that will bring you down. The inevitable collision with her former family occurred when they tried to sabotage one of her shipments, desperate to regain their lost control and prestige. Her cousins, using their characteristic brute force, organized an ambush on a rural road where one of her trucks was scheduled to pass. However, they underestimated her intelligence. Sandra, anticipating their move, had leaked false information. The truck they attacked was filled with fertilizer, while the real cargo passed safely along another route. Their humiliation was complete and public in the underworld. In response, Sandra didn't retaliate with violence, but with a financial blow, using her contacts to freeze one of their main money laundering accounts. She was showing them that the new war in Jalisco would not be won with bullets, but with brains. Despite her rise, Sandra was not immune to the weight of her actions. The need to maintain order within her organization forced her to make a decision that would haunt her. The genius pilot she had recruited, the man expelled from the Air Force, began using heavy drugs, becoming a security risk to the operations. After several warnings and attempts to help, he made a serious mistake that nearly exposed a delivery point. With a heavy heart, Sandra knew there was no choice. The execution was quick and discreet, but the image of the man she had promised to protect would not leave her mind. That night she sat alone on her balcony, drinking tequila, and for the first time since her journey began, she allowed herself to cry, not for him, but for the part of herself she had to kill to survive in that world. Amidst the constant surveillance and strategic planning, Sandra found a rare moment of peace in an old photo album. One particular image caught her eye: herself at 15, smiling innocently beside her father before the family. Business consumed him and led to his death. She remembered that girl, full of dreams that didn't involve trafficking routes or money laundering. Where had that girl gone? Was the ruthless queen she had become a fortress built to protect that vulnerable youth, or was it her tomb? The contrast between the innocence of the past and the bloody reality of the present was a vertiginous abyss. Putting the photo away, she felt a chill. Power was a drug more addictive than the cocaine she sold, and she feared she was overdosing with no chance of recovery. While Sandra sank into her reflections, Agent Harrison of the DEA was making a significant breakthrough. Analyzing intercepted communications, he found an anomaly: a series of recurring payments to a small seafood import-export company. The company belonged to the aunt of the accountant Sandra had recruited. It was a weak link, a loose thread in the perfectly woven fabric of the veil. Harrison didn't act immediately. Like a patient hunter, he began to surveil the accountant, hoping she would lead him not just to a shipment, but to the Queen herself. The network, which once seemed impenetrable, now had a small tear, and Harrison was ready to rip it wide open. The hunt was becoming personal, a duel of minds across continents. Sandra's ambition knew no borders. The American market was lucrative, but she envisioned a global network. She began using her influence to open negotiations with the Italian mafia, the 'Ndrangheta, seeking to expand her operations into Europe. The negotiation was tense, held on a luxury yacht off the coast of Cancun. The Italian men were skeptical, wary of dealing with a woman. But once again, Sandra's intelligence and preparation prevailed. She presented a flawless logistics plan and offered them a stake in a new transatlantic route that was practically detection-proof. By the end of the meeting, she had not only secured a deal, but also the grudging respect of the mobsters. She was no longer just spreading chaos in Jalisco. She was becoming a disruptive force in global organized crime. The loyalty Sandra valued so highly was tested again, this time from within her inner circle. One of her bodyguards, seduced by a generous offer from a rival cartel, passed on information about one of her safe houses. The betrayal was discovered before an attack could be launched, thanks to Sandra's calculated paranoia, which included surveillance systems on her own people. The punishment was swift and served as a lesson to all. She didn't kill the traitor immediately. Instead, she stripped him of everything: his money, his family, his reputation. She left him alive but destroyed, a ghost to remind everyone the price of disloyalty. The message was clear. Death was a mercy her enemies didn't deserve. The Queen of the Pacific protected her kingdom with tooth and nail, and betrayal was the only unforgivable sin. The cracks in the relationship between Sandra and El Tigre widened into a chasm. The tension exploded during the planning of a crucial operation. Juan Diego, impatient and aggressive, advocated for an all-out force approach to eliminate a rival cartel encroaching on their territory. Sandra, on the other hand, argued for a more subtle solution, a hostile takeover using blackmail and financial pressure. "You still think like a street thug," she yelled during the argument. "And you've forgotten the smell of gunpowder, Queen," he retorted. The argument transcended business. It was a clash of egos, a clash of two forces of nature who refused to yield. The love and passion that had united them were now overshadowed by the struggle for control, and they both knew their joint empire could not survive with two sovereigns. Jalisco was bleeding. Sandra's war for control was no longer a silent chess match. As the conflict escalated, the streets of Guadalajara became the board for an open war. Broad daylight shootouts, bodies hanging from overpasses, and the constant wail of sirens became the new normal. The chaos she had promised to spread with purpose had morphed into a hungry, indiscriminate monster. The glamour of her parties now seemed a mockery in the face of the brutality she financed. The people of Jalisco, caught in the crossfire, whispered her name no longer with admiration, but with deep-seated fear. She wanted to be a queen, but to many of her subjects she had become the personification of death itself, a fallen angel who brought hell to their land. The violence of the war inevitably took a personal toll. Her security chief, the loyal man she recruited who protected her fiercely, was caught in an ambush intended for her. He died protecting her escape route, taking several bullets meant for his queen. Watching him die in her arms, whispering words of loyalty until his last breath, broke something inside Sandra. For the first time, death wasn't a statistic or a strategic necessity. It had a face, the face of a friend. Grief mingled with an incandescent fury. The war was no longer about power or respect. It was about annihilation. She would not rest until every one of her enemies, from her traitorous cousins to the rival cartels, was reduced to dust and ashes. The queen was in mourning, and her grief would be a death sentence for many. With pressure from the DEA mounting and rivals uniting against her, Sandra knew she needed a decisive move. She planned her most daring operation yet, a single 20-ton shipment of cocaine, transported by a black market 747 cargo plane, which would land on a clandestine airstrip in the Sonoran Desert. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. Success would make her untouchable, the most powerful figure in the global drug trade. Failure would mean total ruin. This was her decisive action, her final challenge to a system trying to crush her. It's in moments like these that a legend is forged. There's a strength that comes when you bet everything on yourself, a feeling of absolute power. If you understand that feeling of risking it all for a dream, join us. Subscribe, because your story also deserves to be told. As Sandra prepared her final move, the walls were closing in. Agent Harrison, using the information from the surveillance on the accountant, managed to plant a tracker on one of the organization's vehicles. For the first time, the DEA had a real-time view of the movements of Sandra's inner circle, collaborating with an elite unit of the Mexican Navy, the same one that intercepted her first shipment. They assembled a joint task force. Harrison could taste victory. He was no longer hunting a ghost. He had a trail, a target, and he was getting closer by the hour. The feeling of being hunted was new to Sandra, a constant pressure on the back of her neck that made her doubt every shadow, every friendly face. During a sleepless night, Sandra found herself before a chessboard in her office, the onyx and marble pieces cold beneath her fingers. She saw herself as the Black Queen, the most powerful piece, yet also the most targeted. Every move she made was calculated, but for every advance, the board seemed to conspire against her, with pawns, her rivals, rooks, the authorities, and knights, the traitors, surrounding her. Her opponent, the White King, was an anonymous, relentless force, the system. She realized that in the end, it might not be about winning the game, but about taking down as many enemy pieces as possible before her inevitable checkmate. It was a battle for anarchy, an attempt to prove that a single piece could defy all the logic of the board before being removed. The game was in its final phase, and she would not go down without a fight. To protect the 747 operation, Sandra's brutality reached a new peak. She ordered a wave of preemptive strikes against her rivals, a campaign of terror designed to keep them disorganized and focused on their own survival. The violence was shocking even by cartel standards. Mass shootings in Sanadin restaurants, car bombs in front of police stations, and the kidnapping of rival leaders' family members. She justified these as necessary moves to protect her investment and her people, but deep down she knew she had crossed a line. The chaos she once controlled was now controlling her, demanding ever greater blood sacrifices. The woman who had cried for her pilot's death now ordered massacres without blinking, her transformation into a monster nearly complete. One day before the plane's scheduled arrival, she received a call on an encrypted phone. It was one of her oldest and highest-paid contacts, a general in the Mexican army. The message was short and direct. The desert operation is compromised. The DEA and the Navy know. Flee the country, Sandra. Disappear. It's your only chance. For a moment, her self-preservation instinct screamed at her to listen. She could take a fortune in diamonds and vanish, live the rest of her life in luxurious anonymity. But pride, the refusal to be defeated, and the need to prove she was smarter than all of them, held her back. Hanging up the phone, she made her decision. She would not run. She would face the storm head-on, trusting in her ability to beat the odds one more time. The human cost of her war became painfully clear in a brief news flash on TV. A report on the rising violence in Guadalajara showed an interview with a mother crying over the death of her 10-year-old daughter, caught in the crossfire of a cartel shootout. The girl was wearing a dress Sandra recognized from one of the luxury boutiques she frequented. For an instant, the crime queen saw not a statistic, but a real child, an innocent life crushed under the weight of her ambition. She quickly turned off the television, but the image remained seared in her mind. The chaos she had sown had deep, poisonous roots, and it was destroying the very soil she claimed to rule. The weight of her reign had never felt so overwhelming. Sandra's greatest vulnerability, the only chink in her armor, was her teenage son, whom she kept hidden and protected in a luxury boarding school in Switzerland. Her enemies, realizing they couldn't defeat her by force, decided to attack her soul. Agent Harrison, discovering the boy's existence through financial records, used this information as a psychological weapon. He had Swiss authorities conduct a welfare check at the school, a subtle message. At the same time, her cartel rivals sent photos of her son, taken by paparazzi, to one of her phones. The message was clear: we can reach him at any time. Sandra was forced into an impossible dilemma: protect her empire or protect her son, knowing that any move to ensure his safety would expose her even more. On the night before the plane's arrival, the tension at the hacienda was almost unbearable. The operation was in motion and could no longer be stopped. The DEA and the Navy were moving into their positions in the desert. Her rivals were watching, waiting to pick at her remains. Sandra found El Tigre on the balcony, both of them observing the silent night. There was no more anger between them, only the resignation of two sovereigns before their final battle. "Whatever the outcome," he said, breaking the silence, "it was an honor to ride into the storm with you, Queen." She just nodded, a rare moment of connection amid the impending chaos. The empire they had built together was about to be consolidated or go up in smoke, and as the first light of dawn threatened to break the horizon, Sandra Beltrán prepared to face her destiny. The massive silhouette of the 747 tore through the night sky of the Sonoran desert, a metal leviathan descending toward the promise of a consolidated empire. In her command center, dozens of miles away, Sandra watched multiple screens, their glow reflecting in her tense eyes. The pilot confirmed the start of the landing procedure. "Turn on the runway lights now," she ordered over the communicator. Seconds of silence dragged on, heavy and abnormal. The response from her team leader on the ground came choked with panic. "We have no control, Queen. The system isn't responding." And then the desert's darkness was violently broken, not by her guidance lights, but by dozens of blinding floodlights from military vehicles that emerged from the sand like slumbering beasts. The trap, meticulously planned, had snapped shut on her with the force of a steel jaw. Chaos erupted in the control room. Shouts, panic, and the sound of running men echoed around her. But Sandra remained motionless, an island of icy calm in the midst of the storm. Adrenaline sharpened her mind, turning fear into pure strategic clarity. "Abort landing! Full power!" she yelled into the microphone to the pilot, her firm voice cutting through the hysteria. "Shadow Squad, engage the eastern perimeter. I want a diversion. Don't let them get a clean shot at the plane." It was a desperate gamble, sacrificing her best men to give the plane a minimal chance of escaping the siege. She knew the odds were almost zero, but in her world, inaction was the only true defeat. Even at the end, the Queen would not surrender her most valuable piece without fighting down to the last pawn. On the ground, Agent Harrison watched the spectacle of fire and fury with grim satisfaction. The huge plane struggled to gain altitude, a wounded whale trying to escape a fleet of hunters as tracer rounds streaked across the night. Years of pursuit, dead ends, and frustration culminated in that moment. "Focus on the engines and wings. I want that bird on the ground, not in pieces," he ordered into his radio. The cocaine was important, but the intelligence inside that aircraft, the flight logs, the communication equipment, the cargo itself, was the thread that would lead him directly into the heart of the labyrinth, to the lair of the woman who had become his obsession. The Queen may have moved her pieces with mastery, but he had anticipated. Her castle and checkmate was just one move away. Sandra knew the failure wasn't just a matter of an informant. It was sophisticated technological sabotage. Someone from within had not only talked, but had handed over the digital keys to her kingdom. Averting her gaze from the losing battle, she focused on a small screen in the corner, the security camera from El Tigre's location. He wasn't coordinating reinforcements or panicking. He was standing on a balcony, a cell phone pressed to his ear, calmly watching the destruction unfold in the distance. In that instant, the ice in her veins turned to fire. The ultimate betrayal came not from an enemy, nor an envious cousin, but from the man with whom she had shared her bed and her empire. Juan Diego had sacrificed her to save himself, securing his own survival by negotiating her downfall. Facing the total collapse of her most audacious operation, with the plane now in flames, falling in slow motion in the desert, and her men being captured or killed, Sandra faced her final decision as a commander. On her desk, a single red button blinked discreetly, the 747's self-destruct protocol, designed to incinerate the cargo and all evidence in case of catastrophic failure. She could press it, turning her biggest gamble into a billion-dollar funeral pyre, denying victory to everyone. Or she could let the wreckage be searched, which would inevitably lead to her door, but would give her men on the ground a chance to surrender and perhaps survive. The choice was no longer about power or money. It was about the legacy she would leave for those who had been loyal to the end. With a sigh that carried the weight of her crumbling empire, she moved her hand away from the red button. Her choice was made. To all men on the ground, the operation is over. Surrender. I repeat, surrender. It has been an honor. Her voice crackled over the communicators, a final decree from a deposed queen. She then opened a private channel, dialing El Tigre's number. He answered, and the silence between them contained volumes of betrayal and lost love. "Enjoy your kingdom of ashes, Juan," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Before he could reply, she hung up and began, with terrifying calm, to systematically destroy her command center. Every hard drive she smashed, every document she burned, was an act of acceptance, the end of her chaotic reign, executed by her own hands. The raid on the hacienda by Mexican Special Forces and the DEA was surprisingly quiet. Expecting a bloodbath, they found only empty corridors and the smell of burnt paper. They found Sandra in her office, not cornered in a bunker, but sitting elegantly behind her mahogany desk, a half-empty glass of tequila beside her. She showed no surprise or fear when Agent Harrison entered, his weapon pointed at her. Their eyes met, and in them was a mutual understanding, the reluctant respect between two great players at the end of the game. She raised her glass slightly, in a silent toast, then placed her hands on the desk, ready for the handcuffs. The Queen of the Pacific wasn't captured. She allowed herself to be taken. The chaos had finally found its center and grown still. The maximum security prison did not break Sandra Beltrán, it transformed her. The cold concrete and unceasing silence of her cell were a brutal counterpoint to the opulence and constant noise of her former life. Stripped of her designer clothes, her power, and her feared name, she was forced to confront herself, the woman behind the myth of the Queen of the Pacific. There were no more strategies to plot or enemies to eliminate, only the empty hours and the weight of her choices. The memories of the lives she had altered, both those she took and those she protected, became her only companions. The cell was not a cage for a monster, but a mirror that reflected the complex tapestry of ambition, power, and loss that was her life, forcing her to face the legacy of chaos she had left behind. Her extradition to the United States was a media spectacle. Treated like a dangerous celebrity, she faced the cameras and courtrooms with an impassive dignity that frustrated her accusers. During the trial, she remained largely silent, refusing to trade information for a reduced sentence. Her silence was her last fortress, her final weapon against the system that had captured her. She denied Agent Harrison the confession he so craved, and the world the spectacle of her remorse. To the public, she became an enigmatic symbol. To some, an personification of evil. To others, a twisted feminist icon, a woman who dared to play the men's game and almost won. In her silence, she maintained control of her own narrative to the very end. The kingdom of ashes that Sandra had predicted for El Tigre materialized with grim accuracy. Without her strategic vision, Juan Diego was just another violent and impulsive drug lord. His rise was brief, and his reign was bloody and unstable. He was consumed by the same violence he preached, falling to an emerging cartel less than 2 years after Sandra's capture. Likewise, her family's cartel, deprived of her leadership and the competition that kept them sharp, withered into a footnote in the history of drug trafficking. Their fall proved a bitter truth. The chaos Sandra had spread in Jalisco was a force controlled by her intelligence. Without her, only anarchy remained, a power vacuum that consumed all who tried to fill it. After Serving her sentence, Sandra Beltrán was released. The woman who emerged from the prison gates was older, the lines on her face telling the story of her rise and fall, but the fire in her eyes had not been extinguished. The world, however, had moved on. New names, new cartels, and new wars dominated the headlines. She was a relic, a legend whispered in old narco corridos. This obscurity was, paradoxically, her final freedom. She walked into an anonymous life, the woman who once controlled the Pacific roots now blending into the crowd, carrying the weight of her past not as a crown, but as an indelible part of who she was. A survivor, the queen of an empire lost to memory. In a rare interview years later, granted to a journalist on the condition of anonymity, an older Sandra reflected on her journey, not with regret, but with stark clarity. "Power is an ocean," she said, her voice calm. "You can try to navigate it, you can try to command the tides, but in the end, it either pulls you under or washes you back to shore, naked and alone. I danced with the tide, and I survived the storm." Her story is a reminder that the lines between good and evil are often written by the victors. Accounts like this teach us about the complexity of human ambition and the price one pays for it. If you value these lessons, subscribe and continue the journey with us, because every shared story helps us understand a little more about ourselves.